Welcome to HSDF the Podcast, a collection of policy discussions on government technology and homeland security brought to you by the Homeland Security and Defense Forum. In this episode, we discuss the intricate dynamics between leveraging AI, safeguarding personal data, and the proactive measures organizations like FEMA and CISA are implementing. Featuring Bob Costello, Chief Information Officer, CISA, Bobby Hall, Director, Compliance Division, Office of the CIO, FEMA, Shawn Kingsberry, Vice President, Cybersecurity, SAIC, David Simpson, Rear Admiral Retired, U.S. Navy, Virginia Tech, Pamplin Business College Professor in Leadership and Cybersecurity. This discussion took place at the HSDF Cybersecurity Symposium on July 10, 2024.
Talk to us a little bit about the part of your mission that needs to balance we've got all this new data, but now we've got privacy and security concerns that need to be balanced. We need to be thinking about not only the data side of AI, but the algorithms, and do we have algorithm security? Well, what are you doing to get ahead of that? Or is this something that is next year's get ahead of?
Well, I think all of us, whether we're at FEMA or another part of DHS, so we all have like different authorities, and that was like very difficult for me to get used to it. CISA's, I supported law enforcement most of my career, or the intelligence services, even when I was in uniform.
The evidence changed. You've got to take it all the way to prosecution, right? 911 call becomes evidence that you've got to have a chain of custody.
Yeah, and often too, like there were different privacy rules for that. So we take it very, very seriously at CISA, and part of that.
What do you do about it?
Well, so I think that whenever I see an organization, there's still a few federal agencies that do it, where the chief privacy officer reports to the CIO. That's a pretty bad idea.
Yeah.
And so what we do is we have a very tight working relationship between privacy in the CIO's office and our mission operators. So I'd say that that's working quite well. Part of it is, I don't, or CISA does collect some PII or SPII, not to the volume of others. Uh-huh. So often we can deal with it a little bit differently. We are looking at some technologies based on some different aspects of AI. You saw, ONCD Coker talking about CIRCIA. We have to share a lot of those reports. How do we anonymize them? How do we do things like that? So we're definitely exploring that. I'd say on, the first thing you have to do anywhere, and this is where I think CISA has really matured over the last 3 years. Like, no one wanted to talk to the CIO's office. And I get it. Like, no one ever calls a CIO and said, wow, that was the best help desk call I ever got.
It's because you guys say no all the time.
But we changed that to kind of say yes. And so people are now coming to us now and saying, I want to do this.
That's great.
And, it doesn't alleviate all the problems. Like anyone, I have either rogue IT or a program that they're like, we're ready to go FOC. We didn't even know you were here. So it's gotten better, but I would say like you have to, I've had to adjust even my personality. It says like I'm slightly less maybe aggressive than I was at CBP. Slightly. I think Dan's like, no, he's not. But I think those are things that we're doing here. Probably similar to FEMA, but probably a little bit different based on your mission.
Well, let's go to Bobby next, because Bobby, your agency all the time deals with people at a very dark part in their lives, right? They just lost their home, they're now applying for a loan, or they're wanting assistance. That to them, they want the assistance, but they also want a degree of privacy associated with that. How are you guys approaching this challenge, and what would you like to see from industry? What would you like to see for the group in this room to help you anticipate where the fraudsters are going?
Great question, by the way, too. And privacy and security, from my perspective, is a zero-sum game. And, one would assume that if you have a information system that is properly configured, securely configured, then the privacy piece would be handled by default. And so I kind of look at privacy and security, the balance. I look at the balance really from two different lenses, right? I look at it from a government perspective, where we have privacy and security controls that have to be implemented as part of the authorization to operate process. And so before any information system is allowed to operate in a production network or production environment, it has to have a set of security controls implemented, both privacy and security controls.
So it's not just security that you need to see baked in before granting an ATO. You need to see privacy included in there as well.
Yes, sir. So the NIST Special Publication 800-53 Rev 5 basically identifies a list of privacy and security controls that are applicable for any information system. And so before we decide to authorize a system or, again, put it out there to store, process, and transmit data, it has to have those agreed controls implemented. And so, like Bob was saying before, as the authorizing official, he would essentially review the authorization package, ensure that the risk is up to an acceptable level, and then he would authorize the system, again, based on a risk approach. However, I kind of look at privacy and security from a different lens, as we talk about the commercial side, right? And so I have, my mother is 65 years old right now, and, she's utilizing like ChatGPT and things of that nature to include social media, right? And so I think trying to better educate and train the user community on certain things about their privacy data and how it's important for them to really understand how their data is being collected, utilized, and also, shared amongst different entities. And so I was reading an article back when I was in Intel school many years ago, and then
last week.
It wasn't last week, but it was about the government surveillance program, but then also national security interests. And so there's a different part of me that says, well, how do you balance the nuances of privacy and security when you have national interests at play, but then you also have a right to protect, personal data, right? And so, and I think another article, I think this goes back to when I was in the Marine Corps, when I think it was, I want to say San Bernardino, it was California, where I think it was a mass murder committed. And then I think the U.S. government wanted to access the information that was on the iPhone, and Apple said no. And so, again, trying to balance, privacy and security from that perspective, it's a real slippery slope. And so, from a government perspective, I would say that we have a pretty robust process in place in terms of security control requirements that need to be met. But then when I look at it from the commercial side of the house, I don't think we're there yet. And, again, in terms of national security interest, in terms of protecting, personal data, who wins? I mean, I understand that Apple did not turn over that data, but there needs to be a better balance, and also I would say a better partnership between the government and the industry in terms of what constitutes the sharing of personal data as it relates to national security.
That's a great example. This is the San Bernardino case, and I actually was in the PSAP and spoke with the director of the Public Safety Answering Point of San Bernardino about 6 months after that, and he was a uniformed officer. He was just doing his 2 years in charge of the Public Safety Answering Points, which are 80 to 90% women. His deputy was the 20-year professional, had been doing 911 all his life. He, fortunately, at the time, was actually 2 or 3 blocks away from where the incident occurred. He went right to the incident, was the first officer on seeing the incident, and he said, at that point in time, I realized how much I didn't know about what my deputy knew in execution of that job, because his planning world went to what in the Marine Corps we call 5 and 25. Went right to the incident happened. I am thinking about staying alive, and then I'm thinking about the next officer that's going to back me up. And he said she was amazing. She had all this data at her disposal, and began to be his 5 minutes out, 10 minute out, 30 minute out kind of planner. And she recognized that they had a SWAT exercise going down with another jurisdiction and re-vectored them to. It's just a great story for which often that part of it gets lost when we look at could we get into the phones or not? But that's a great example of what should citizens expect in the degree of protection of their data. And I think they should expect a whole lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have one more point too before you pass it over to Shawn over here. I think my concern isn't about privacy and security as it relates to the government per se. I think my biggest concern is about all the information that that's available about me in the public domain, or all the information that we collectively share on social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram and whatever the case may be. And all that information, in a lot of cases are information that's available in the public space because you post it. And then once that information is collected by, different individuals, and then it's fed into some type of AI capability, then what happens with that? And so for me, it goes back to, being cyber conscious, being, security aware, and understanding that you do have a right to understand how your data is being collected, how it's being utilized. But then there's also a responsibility on end users to ensure that, they put the right guardrails in place to protect their data as well. So,
yeah. So, yes, to users need to be aware, but I would also suggest that the CISO's umbrella for that very point that you raised is expanding and needs to continue to expand.
Correct.
Because even if you completely stay off social media, right, and have a 100% piece, maybe what you've done is create a vacuum that now can be filled by deep fakes. So cognitive attacks are real. Yeah. And we see cognitive attacks ongoing every single hour of every single day in Ukraine right now. On the front lines, both sides have set up bot armies that intend to take sometimes a accurate video, sometimes a doctored video, and then to transmit it from the actual location so that it can then get viral in a way that gets around the social media platform defensive measures to spot fakes. So the job of a CISO, as we bring in social media, just gets harder. And we can no longer say we're protected just because I'm not using social media, right? If you're not looking at social media, somebody's probably on it for you. Yeah. I supported General Odierno in Iraq for the over a year while I was there. He had no time for social media, but somebody set up an account in his name and was soliciting donations for wounded warriors when he had a son who was a wounded warrior. And that's how pernicious it was. And that went on for over a year where somebody in his name was stealing money off that. So this cognitive space now needs to be defended. And if the CISOs don't have a role in defending that, who within organizations do? But I do want to finish out the slate here with Shawn. That balance between privacy and security, how you use data to actually achieve positive security effects with things like AI, but how you also in that respect the legitimate expectation of citizens to have their secrets kept secret.
So first I'll come back to Bob's statement when career is over. So when I was a CIO, they basically said, hey, if we actually have a breach, you're going to be charged. Right, I was actually going to be charged.
The libel guy.
Right? I don't know if y'all remember our American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and the likes. So they basically said, hey, you're going to be charged. I said, well, great. I don't look good in orange, so we're going to get this done, so I won't be charged. But the story behind that is the information that was collected. It's not about the individual pieces of data. It's when you collect and connect that data that turns it into powerful information. So
context, the context around the data.
Because now you have the context, right? And then you can figure out other contexts, right? So now you start to look at privacy when you look at the challenges, right? One, and I like the way, like Bob put it, right? When you separate federal systems from, I'm going to say, individuals, right? When you look at the generation today, the younger generation, which is the majority that's actually using a lot of the technology today, right? They have a completely different perspective of what equals person, right? So in essence, the information is getting put out and it's going to happen, right? And now when you start to say, what does that mean when these individuals are also interacting with government systems now? Like when you have to get benefits, right? Could be child welfare or the likes, right? What have you? So you go to these systems. Now is when you have the issues with fraud, waste, and abuse, right? And now you have all this information that's out here. But now you start to get into how do you now? And now you get into this interesting balance of privacy and security when you're building the protection systems and the models that you're using to protect. You know, when I always say I'll always be a civil servant, right? After 22 years. But in essence, you start to say, my job is to protect the information of this country and the citizens, in essence, you start to look at that a lot differently, and you start to look at the internals of that, because now you're bringing in sensitive information on individuals. You're bringing in, I know who's on the terrorist watch list. I can now do, third, fourth, and fifth degree between separation of individuals and the likes, and to entities, and to parent and child connections between entities, right? And now you start to say, you got some that would say that is an issue between privacy and security. But in essence, it's a role that you have to do to actually protect the mission that you're responsible for. And like I said, it's a domino effect. You can look at that in many models. I mean, you'd be surprised to actually know one of the key attack vectors is actually hospitals, right? I mean, and you look at, just think about the information that you have there, and ransoms of hospital equipment with people that are actually on the table. So it becomes interesting. So now zoom out. Federal systems, 100%. NISA 153 Rev 5, FedRAMP Rev 5, policies, controls have to be put in play. And that's when the whole continuous ATO comes into play. Because now, to me, it's one thing to say, I have a system infrastructure in play, but am I using old school governance, or do I actually have automation that verifies on a daily basis that these controls are, especially technical controls, but you can also use documentation as code, right, to actually do verification of some of the non-technical controls, but now to actually scorecard that and have that drive action out the other end, right? So now you work differently, right? Because that's the beauty in federal systems, because you do have to have an ATO. And that means you do have to go through this process to have all of the privacy and all of the security and the controls and how you execute them and how you can verify that they're actually in production. But I still say, when you begin to connect that zero trust with IT modernization, cyber by design, and you include continuous ATO, now, at least from a government perspective, government systems will be more resilient. And it's happening, right? And I can tell you now, several federal agencies, to include Department of Treasury, VA, several DOD type agencies actually have implemented this, right? So it's not something that's like sci-fi, it's real and can happen.
I love the idea of the continuous risk scoring, because if you have that mindset where every day you're going to look at your risk scorecard, you then bin that, right? You triage it, and you say, oh, there's some of this risk we can address right now today. I just need to go down to the watch floor and talk to the folks, change our process a little bit. But there's some of the risk that you can't address today, but you can talk to a vendor that may have an approach. And there's some risk that is much longer term that you said, look, we're going to have to accept some of this risk for now and mitigate it in other ways.
Well, let me build on to that. I can tell you now, a agency actually applied an SLA on 90% compliant to continuous ATO based on the control of the system.
Yeah, so it goes back to kind of where Harry Coker finished, right? And for universities, right, as we prepare cyber professionals to enter the federal workforce, I think part of that needs to be, how do I write contracts better? How do I look at including things like a novel approach to SLAs? And from a federal agency standpoint, I love the fact that Harry described some of the innovations that will be happening in hiring of workforce that will go towards skills-based and not just have cert-based or degree-based things. So these are all wonderful things.
Thank you for tuning in to HSDF the Podcast. You can follow this podcast on any major podcast platform. Visit hsdf.org to learn more about the Homeland Security and Defense Forum.